Welcome to today's Fortune Admissions webinar. Rejection. Nobody likes it, whether it's for the job that you applied for, the person that you were hoping to date and it turned out wrong, or of course applying to business school. And at this time of the year, as we head into round two, of course, all of those round one applicants are hearing back from schools. For every one individual that gets the nod for an interview from Stanford, there are about 15 or 16 others that do not. In fact, Harvard can't bring itself to use the word rejection, so they talk about releasing you. But getting dinged, being released, rejected, however we like to say it, it is the opportunity to think about, okay, what did I do wrong and where do I go from here? And the idea of organizing today's webinar, as we are about 4 or 5 weeks from all of those round two deadlines, is to look at what you guys can be doing to really shine in the round two admissions pool. Now, of course, with Fortune Admissions, it's my great pleasure to work with a team that has been there, that has both sent out those happy invitations, but also sadly signed the rejection of others. Fortuna is a team of former admissions officers from 8 of the top 10 schools. I think we've pretty much got you covered from the US and Europe. For today's session, we're calling on a couple of our big guns. We've got Judith Hodara, who was formerly the acting director of admissions at the Wharton School and spent 11 years both sending out those lovely acceptances but also working with clients or applicants through rejection. And Caroline Diarte Edwards, who was the director of admissions at INSEAD for 7 years. Caroline's happy story was that she was accepted to INSEAD when she first applied, so didn't have to go through the ding, right, Caroline?
That's right.
So, what are we going to be talking about in the next 50-55 minutes? Well, of course, we'll be leaving plenty of space at the end of this webinar for your questions, and given the expertise that you have sharing with you for today, please do type in with your questions. But just in terms of an agenda, we'll be looking at the consequences of being dinged from round one and where you go from there. We'll also be looking at that window that leads to early January, and I think on the 4th of January, there's something like 11 or 12 of the top schools that all have their round two deadlines. So how do you get ready for that and really optimize the weeks that still remain? We'll be analyzing some of those different elements that may have led to the initial round one rejection, including, of course, the GMAT and the GRE, and certain aspects of your application that you can still improve ahead of those round two deadlines. So I'm delighted to share the next hour with you, Judith and Caroline. Let's get started with the idea of getting the rejection from round one, and what next at this point?
Sure, I can start, Matt. I think it's a very tricky situation for candidates to find themselves in, because generally these days schools don't give feedback. I know that when Judith and I both started in the admissions office, we both gave feedback to rejected candidates, but INSEAD has changed its policy on that, and Wharton also did the same. And generally now top schools don't give feedback, and it's often because they just don't have the capacity to do so, given the large volume of candidates that they're dealing with. And so it can be very difficult for somebody who has put all of their heart and soul into their application to figure out what went wrong, and know therefore be able to figure out what to do next. And I think it's important to try to do some analysis on what may have gone wrong with your application if you do plan to move forward with further applications, so that you can really learn from that experience, incorporate that learning, and therefore be a better candidate next time round. So in the absence of feedback from the school, I mean, there are various things that you can do. You can get somebody else to review your application, ideally somebody who knows the school, perhaps somebody, you might be able to find someone through your network who's an alum from the school. So you could ask somebody who has some connection with the school community to review your application. We also do, of course, we do ding analysis for our clients, and try to get some honest feedback from them. It can be useful to get a perspective from someone who hasn't seen your application before, who doesn't necessarily know your profile inside out, to give you their analysis of how do they think you fit with the school community. So getting some additional feedback, I think, is important, rather than just sort of trying to figure out by yourself what could have gone wrong. And then also try contacting your interviewers. Now, some interviewers will be more forthcoming than others. With schools where the interviews are conducted by alumni, often those alumni will be happy to share some input, share some feedback. Sometimes they might be quite surprised. It can often happen that the interviews actually went well, and still, just because of the level of competition, you haven't got through the final selection process. But the interviewer may have a perspective on, given the candidates they see, that they've seen over time, where they think you might have fallen down. So they might actually, not have the feedback themselves from the school, but they may have a useful opinion on what could have gone wrong.
One thing I want to say about contacting the alums is make sure that you keep it cordial. These are not people that necessarily sank your application, and the relationships between alumni and schools go on a long, long, long time. And so I'm just suggesting this from experience. You sort of want to ask for advice and do not blame them, because
exactly.
Maybe write a note to admissions afterwards and say, I had a lovely chat with Danielle, and she's wonderful, would love to see her in the pool next year. Or, hey, I talked to Mark, he was really aggressive with me, and I just don't think he belongs here. So just keep that in mind, that as you reach out to alums, who most likely are going to give you generalized supportive feedback, that relationship that they have behind the scenes is still going on. And in all likelihood, they're not going to be able to point to one thing and say, if you had done this differently, you would have been admitted. But really, they're going to talk to you, as Caroline suggested, about the competition, about the match, and keeping those things in the back of your mind as well.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. And another thing you can do is to reevaluate, the school's admissions requirements, look at the profile of the typical students, and then, literally draw up a table with the different criteria, and see how you match up against each of those elements. Sometimes a candidate may have a weak GMAT and assume that, for example, because they have a strong GPA or a good undergraduate track record, the GMAT score is not so important. Well, to a certain extent, undergrad track record can compensate for the GMAT, but when you're in a very competitive process and you're being compared to other fantastic candidates, you can be pipped at the post, in that very competitive environment if you have, a slightly lower GMAT score. So it could be something as simple as that you might have assumed, would not be damaging to your application. Another thing I would suggest doing is reaching out to your recommenders, and just, get a sense from them whether they actually gave the time that that they should have given to your recommendation. As admissions directors, we've certainly seen applications where the recommender had obviously dashed something off in the last minute and not given it sufficient time, and written very brief and rather unhelpful recommendations, and that can be damaging to a great candidate, and it's very unfortunate when that happens. So I would suggest, having a conversation with the recommenders, if possible, face-to-face, because if you send them an email, you might not get such a good sense for, what actually happened. And if you meet with them face-to-face, you might get a better sense for, they might feel uncomfortable telling you, actually, yes, I did submit it half an hour before the deadline and I only had 15 minutes to do it. They might not tell you that on email, but if you meet with them face-to-face, you might get a better sense for what actually happened. And we've certainly seen applications where, unfortunately, it's really been the negligence of the recommender that has sunk the application.
One thing I wanted to add is that you want to go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and perhaps you'll be speaking to this, Judith. I mean, it's hard to see rejection from a business school as anything other than personal. And as you read that email or the letter, you know, Stanford doesn't love me, or Wharton doesn't want me, and yet, of course, these are schools that are accepting just a few hundred among the many thousands that apply. Judith, you've often talked about, of course, the joy of crafting a class, the diversity of voices, experience, but it was tough to then turn down individuals that you knew were very talented, great individuals, but you simply did not have the capacity to make offers to all of those individuals. So they shouldn't give up altogether, right?
That's for sure, and I think that really starts with a very hard look at what you've presented. This is not it's almost antithetical, but you don't want to be on the defensive. But I had this, but I had that, I would have been great. You really want to almost start from scratch and say, okay, I need to look at where the holes were. So it's like an offensive move, right? You're not defending yourself against the rejection. You're looking forward, as you see my hands coming towards the camera, what you're going to be able to do next. And when I was at Wharton, we frequently would see people in the reapplicant pool that had either taken a class outside of work to increase their quantitative ability, that had gotten to know the culture of the school a little bit better, that were clearer on what their career goals were going to be. They knew what it was they wanted to do on campus. So, and I think at INSEAD and the other schools as well, there's an understanding that comes with a year of additional work experience, getting to know yourself a little bit better. It doesn't mean that everything that you sent in the first time wasn't admissible. It just means, as Matt was referring, with a pool of 9,000 or 10,000, you really are going to need to hone that message and that presentation. And in any given year, the statistics on reapplicants were actually higher than first-time applicants. So the rate of admission when I was at Wharton for reapps was significant. Which is something certainly to keep in mind. And I do think that
why do you think that was, Judith? It was second time around individuals had been through that analysis, perhaps strengthened certain areas of the profile, retaken a test, but did the school also appreciate the level of sort of commitment and be coming back to the school and saying, no, really, you're the school that I want to study at?
That's a really interesting question, and I would hesitate to say it is merely the act of coming back, because sometimes people will come back 3 and 4 and 5 times, and they shouldn't have been. It's right. Coming back appropriately with a dedicated, targeted response, and that you've taken the time, and I feel this very deeply with students that we work with now at Fortuna, and that students that we didn't take when I was at Wharton, that were crushed by the rejection, but were able to then say, okay, this is what I'm missing. This is what I need to do. I'm going to go and tell my supervisor on Monday, I want to reapply. I need more hands-on projects. I want to bring people to the table more. I'd like to run something outside of work. So in a way, it opens up a lot of different opportunities. And it was, I would also, as an add-on, it is not just the reapplication that helps. It is, you can't send in the same essay. You can't send in the exact same resume. You can't leave every well enough alone and just send it in again and hope. You really need to actively craft, like you're going back to the drawing board and saying, okay, well, here's the clay, and how am I going to make it look a little different this time around, and what am I going to send in as support? So that was really what the reapplication was about. And again, I don't know if there's anybody on the call today that's applied multiple times. There comes a point of no return, and that's usually we rarely, if ever, at Caroline, I don't know if you did, I never saw a 3-time reapp get admitted. It was usually at that point, like, cut bait and try something else.
Yeah. Yeah. And something else that can, can sink an application, sometimes it's just the career goals. So it's not even necessarily, the profile of the candidate or how they interviewed or, anything on paper beyond, what they say about what they want to do in the future. And if the career goals are a concern for the admissions committee, it may be that, what they're seeking to do is just not realistic given their background. Schools are thinking about how employable that their admits will be, and they want to bring people into the program who are going to be able to succeed and achieve their goals and not be disappointed. And sometimes, candidates don't do enough research into, what is feasible post-MBA, and really think about, their own profile and how they can leverage that profile in the future. And so, it's important to evaluate that aspect of your application as well.
Right. So the story doesn't stop there with the rejection from round one, but from what both of you have been saying, this really is the opportunity to take a dive into and with real candor and analyze and look for feedback. So now we're faced with the challenge of round two and bringing all of that learning with us. Today is December 1st, with many of those deadlines that begin, I think, with Michigan on January the 2nd, and then Harvard, Kellogg, Haas, Stanford, that they all have a deadline within a few days of one another, straight after the holidays. So what next? What do you think are the challenges for round two as we sit here sort of 4 or 5 weeks from those deadlines?
I think some of them are psychological. If you've been rejected from one of your top schools in round one, and maybe you don't find out until mid-December, it is hard. I think if you don't get an interview, you have a little bit more time to get used to the idea. But if you don't find out until mid-December, it is really hard to say, okay, well, I'm gonna go for my next set of schools right now. And so that's why we recommend kind of keeping yourself up, assuming that you're going to be applying in round two. And planning those. You don't want to open up the essay questions, on December 16th and say, wow, I've got 3 weeks and this is what I want to be doing. So you really, to me, some of it is a mental game of just sustaining yourself, lifting yourself up in the process and feeling like I'm going into round two. I don't know if I'm going to have to do it, but I'm going to keep my energy levels where they need to be. And certainly not panicking at that date. So today's December 1st. This afternoon, when you're done with this discussion, go and look at what the other schools are asking you that you might be applying to. I think that coming out ahead of the game is going to make you feel, there's nothing worse than being rejected and then feeling like panicked and like, wow, we're in a crisis mode and now I have to act. I would tell you to really start to do some outlining as soon as this weekend, if you can, just sort of start to think about possible next steps.
Right. And based on sort of some of your early comments, if in that analysis, an individual really should think about going away and getting another year or two of professional experience or international experience for the likes of INSEAD and LBS, of course, there's some longer-term planning involved. But if the margins were such that now looking at schools in round two, it's not that you need to perhaps fundamentally then change your career goals, but just widen the net and some of the schools that you're then looking at. Yeah,
I would say having that commitment is even more important in round two. So as Judith said, it can be, we certainly see sometimes candidates losing, the drive a little bit in round two because they've worked so hard for the round one schools. It's been such a big effort, and they may well still be waiting for decisions on round one, and so not quite sure about whether they really need to commit to round two or not. And so, that can be an issue. And at the same time, you almost need to show more commitment to the schools in round two, because a lot of schools will see a bump in application volume in round two versus round one because people are getting rejected from the very, very top schools, and so moving further down their list, and the schools are aware of that, and so they don't want to feel that you are applying to them as a sort of backup, and somehow you're half-hearted about your application, and so it's even more important, I would say, in round two to show that commitment, to show the motivation, to show the enthusiasm, and to show insight into what the program is about and what the community is about, and so that's something that it's an ongoing process to plan your work, but also to build your knowledge and insight into the school, and continue with networking with the school is very important throughout this period. And I mean, another challenge I think that round 2 candidates face is that, you know, it's a very busy time of year for everybody anyway. And, you know, often people are thinking about, you know, holiday festivities and vacation and, you know, office parties and lots of other things going on. And so, you know, there's a lot of distractions that can impact, you know, how much free time you have to work on your application. So people sometimes overestimate how much time they will have, you know, over the holiday period to work on their applications, and or even, you know, overestimate how much they'll feel like, you know, spending time in front of their computer over the holiday period as well. So, you know, do get a head start on it now if you haven't done so already, because, you know, the last minute, it's quite rare that, you know, a great application is produced over the last week or so before the application deadline.
One thing that I recommend actually is to go into the office when there's nobody else there. So really, like, take yourself out of your apartment and go to the office, and it's usually going to be pretty quiet, even if you've taken the time off or however you want to work it. But don't work at home, because you then sort of will find a million other things to do. But take yourself out of your surroundings and pretend it's a work day, and you'll be surprised at how much you can actually accomplish if you have the, you know, kind of the wherewithal to do so. I personally like to just sit on a train for 4 hours and, you know, no distractions, can't go anywhere anyway, but you have Wi-Fi, it's perfect. So if you could, you know, travel up and down between New York and Washington, you'll be really productive. But just, again, some of this is really psychological at this point, and you may decide that you don't want to give up the time, and maybe you want to apply for next fall. I mean, there's no time bomb here. And but you have to own it, you know, whatever that decision is. You don't want to just sort of do this. This is not a 65% kind of thing right now. This really needs to be 92, 93%. You are in it until, you know, the first week of January.
Sure.
Right. So just to be clear, swinging from the chandelier at the office party in the full view of your recommender, is that a good or a bad thing for round 2? Actually, just for round 1 and round 2, and I know that, you know, we've discussed this many times, that there's this sort of common misconception that, you know, I really should apply to the most selective schools in round 1, and then you know, other schools in round 2. But as Caroline just pointed out, you know, many schools will see a spike in round 2 applications from people that didn't get into the Harvards and Whartons of the world. So, Judith, you've often talked about the M7 schools. You have this wonderful expression, I think, about them being round agnostic. Yes. Between round 1 and round 2. So maybe you can talk about, you know, round 1 wasn't the be-all and end-all, that you've still got, you know, a tremendous opportunity applying to those schools in round 2, but also this, you know, Caroline talked about the need to really show the love to other schools that you're now considering that may have a spike in applicant volume. So can you talk us through that?
Sure. So being round agnostic, I don't know if I should trademark that one, but I think it's a good phrase. It really meant that schools like Wharton did not care if you were applied in round 1 or round 2. They were looking for strong candidates, and so it wasn't as if they filled up their incoming class of 825 in round 1. They didn't take 750 and then leave, you know, sort of a couple more just in case. It was really, they took the really strong, they waitlisted a whole bunch because they didn't know what else was coming down the pike. And there was still room in round 2 for someone that maybe didn't realize they wanted to go to business school until September, or had a change of opportunity, or really wanted to nail a GMAT that was showing them at the 75th percentile or above on the quant section. So lots of different reasons. I would say if you were to do statistical analysis between round 1 and round 2 over a 10-year period, you're not going to see a lot of difference in the makeup of the incoming class. So I would not say to you round 1 means that that your chances of admission are much, much higher than round 2. Round 3 is another story, and I think for most schools, European schools accepted for the most part, and a couple of the U.S. schools, but round 3 is really, they're looking for very specific individuals at that point, and it's not sort of your general pool candidate in round 3. And I usually tell people, unless you're absolutely sure, wait until the following year, because you're going to be much stronger at that point. So again, it is a really interesting discussion to have about when do you apply to your number 1, number 2, number 3 schools. Caroline's going to talk about show us the love, which is, you know, definitely part of this equation. And so you should feel going into round 2 that you have as much opportunity as anyone again, that applied in round one, given if you take the time to create that presentation.
Right, and given the stiff odds that you face in round three, I think for many applicants, round two really is the best shot at this point for a place in the class next year, assuming that the materials are all lined up. Caroline, you talked about pouring heart and soul into those round one applications, and you really started to picture yourself in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and it hasn't worked out. You've now got a fairly short window to really get up to speed with the global network culture at a school like Yale, or collaborative leadership in Evanston at a school like Kellogg, when many alum that you might hope to reach out might be on holiday by the end of the month. So, any advice to to really tap into the culture and personality of schools in the 5-week window that you have?
Yes, yeah. I mean, definitely start sooner rather than later. And I would say, don't spread yourself too thinly. So if you're just starting to work on those applications, and you feel that there is a gap in your knowledge and insight into those schools versus what you were able to show in your round one applications, then I would keep the number of applications that you're working on fairly low, so that you can really dedicate some quality time to that research and networking. And then, I mean, these days there are lots of avenues to explore for learning about the schools. So, beyond the school websites, there's lots of great videos on YouTube where you can get a sense for the student culture, what the faculty are doing. A lot of the schools will be doing events or online chats and so on that you can join to hear, directly from people at the school what it's about, how it's different, ask your questions and so on. And then, see what you can do to connect with people yourself through your own network. Check out on LinkedIn people that or connections of your connections who are members of the school community, and try and have those conversations now, and reach out to as many people as you can. You'll get, if you speak to 5 or 10 different alumni, you're going to get 5 different perspectives on why the school is fantastic, and why they loved it and what they got out of it and how it's made a difference to their lives. So it's important to get some breadth in information sources, so that you get a rounded sense of what the school is about, and where you in particular will fit in, and think not just about how you fit in and how it's a great school for you, but how are you a great student for that community, and what are you going to be able to bring in terms of your experience? What's that going to add to the classroom? Which student clubs are you going to be able to really get involved in and have an impact and take a lead? And even if a lot of that stuff you might not be able to fit it all into your written application, it's important at this stage to also be thinking about preparing yourself for the interview stage, because once you submit your application, it might only be a few weeks before you're called for interview, and this kind of sense for how you fit into the school and what you bring to the school is again not something that you build up overnight. So it should be an ongoing effort that also extends beyond the application deadline. So assume that you will get through to the interview stage and prepare yourself accordingly.
Right. Now, between you spent 18 years at 2 of the world's top business schools, and whether you're reading 25, 30 applications a day, or just the thousands of applications that you have reviewed. And in the 5th and 6th paragraph, there's this list of, well, I want to take this course and that course, and as you know, all of the courses have very long names, and it takes up a lot of space. Could you really tell when an applicant had done their homework and understood the culture of the school? Did it really stand out?
I think that it does. I think that when a student or an applicant takes the time to understand the ethos of the school, talking with alumni, talking with current students, that they learn the language of the school. I sometimes say that applying to business school, you do have to master another language. It's really, how do they talk about themselves? What are their core mission and values? How does that reflect in the community that they've built? So while it's all fine to rattle off, I want to do this, this, and this, I also like to suggest you refer to, in my conversation with so-and-so from class of 00, or in my current conversation with current first-year student, and on my visit, or in my interaction. So you're really engendering not just, I know what you offer as far as, these classes and these opportunities, but that I've talked with someone about what it's actually going to be like when I set foot on campus. What can I expect? What can I bring? And so it is sometimes hard for students that live far away, may or may not be able to visit, but there's so many different ways to learn about what makes a campus tick and what makes a program tick, that I think between all of the references that Caroline has listed, there's almost no excuse for not getting to in your head what this place is all about.
One of our colleagues at Fortune, Julie was a senior associate director at Booth, and worked very closely with Kurt and has stayed in touch with him. And she looks at Booth's essay questions of the last 2 years, where they've moved to choosing 1 out of 12 photographs and talking about your Booth experience. And Julie says, Kurt really doesn't want you to cut and paste from a Wharton application or a Columbia application and say, here, Booth, this is what I have to say. So as we then start to get ready with round 2, there's the temptation of the work that you have done for those round 1 schools, but starting over. It's not just a question now of cutting and pasting the story that you shared with some of those round 1 target schools, but taking a step back and thinking about how your goals, your possible contribution, really then contributes. Certainly INSEAD emphasizes international experience, global mindset, Caroline. So any sort of words of advice for applicants to INSEAD, London Business School, top international schools, to sort of capture that international flavor of the school culture?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. London Business School and INSEAD are quite different in the written application in terms of what you can say about your motivation for the school. So INSEAD does not specifically ask in the written application, why are you applying to INSEAD, whereas that's very much a core part of the written LBS application. But nevertheless, even though they're not explicitly asking for it, you do need to, really have a sense of what the school is looking for. And as you said, international experience is something that is very important for INSEAD, and that needs to come across in your essays. There's the essay about, there are different ways that you can do that. You have to write about, there are a number of questions about your professional experience and your, your career evolution. There's a question about where you need to describe yourself, and that's a great opportunity to talk about some of your, impactful life experiences. So you need to, with INSEAD, they're not asking you explicitly why you're applying and how do you fit in, but you need to think about, what is unique about the school, and how can I convey my fit. And as admissions directors, sometimes see candidates who, completely underplayed their international experience in their application, and you sort of have to try to, pull it out of, various parts of their story to try and figure out, actually, have they spent much time abroad, and what have they got out of that experience? What have they learned? And is being part of an international community something that's genuinely of interest to them? And so, thinking about how you can subtly convey your motivation to be part of a very international network is important for INSEAD. And LBS asks for it much more specifically in the essays. But now, of course, there are also the video questions that you have to respond to for both INSEAD and London Business School. And so some candidates will get questions there from INSEAD about, why you're doing an MBA and why INSEAD. And of course, it's a very important question to have well prepared for the interview stage as well.
Well, maybe we can sort of break down some of the different components that we're putting together, and we'll start with the old favourite, the GMAT. INSEAD's GMAT scores have jumped by another 7 points to a record average. Wharton, it's around 730. And then the breakdown of those scores, it's not just the overall headline score, but points that schools will look at very closely. So words of advice from both of you as people are sort of analysing the profile and what they presented in round one, and where the 740 doesn't promise to get you in, but certain schools can keep the door closed. So what would you say in terms of looking very candidly at your GMAT or GRE schools?
So for the schools, for Wharton and the schools that I work with, you're going to want to be in or around the 75th percentile on the quantitative section of the GMAT. That is with a really big caveat that if you do not have undergraduate expertise, if you never took a calc class, you never took statistics or finance on an undergrad level, you might want to have that in your wheelhouse. So go ahead, sign up for a class online. You can do one locally through a local community college. You can do one through Berkeley Extension. If you live in Washington, D.C., USDA offers them. So these are all ways to kind of shore up your quantitative ability. And I do get a lot of questions about the GRE as well, and those are certainly scores that are accepted by schools. Up until this date, they're generally not used for reporting to U.S. News and World Report. But they are certainly scores that these institutions are going to be taking. So when I say the 75th percentile on the quant, that's really a baseline. You don't want to be too far below that without kind of a very good reason for that fact. And certainly if you're coming from a very quant-heavy professional background, there are going to be almost higher expectations for your ability in that realm as well. One other thing you can do, and I have a lot to say on the subject, is you can have your recommenders say that you do a lot of heavy quant work on a day-to-day basis, or they're amazingly impressed with your quantitative abilities and your analytical skills. So if you feel like somehow your quant is falling short of your own expectations, there are some ways to remedy that. And lastly, if you do decide to take a class and it's in progress during your application cycle, that's completely fine. So don't worry that, oh, I don't have a final grade. You can always get your professor or whoever's grading the exams to kind of give an update and send that over to admissions. So that's going ahead and signing up for that class is actually a pretty good idea.
Can't hear you, Matt.
If your GPA is really low, can the GMAT or the GRE then do all of the work? You talked about sort of signing up for online courses, and as we look at the 4 to 5 week window between now and round 2, there's no chance to take a level 1 CFA exam anytime soon. So if someone is reporting a GPA that's below a 3.0, is this a time to really be very candid about that situation and say, okay, if I do take the additional time over the next 8 to 10 months, not only can I nail the great GMAT or GRE score, but there are these very tangible ways that I can demonstrate to the schools through online, through CPA, CFA, whatever it might be, that I can do the numbers and have the academic acumen that can overcome that weaker GPA.
Yeah, yes, I mean, it may well be worth taking extra time. I mean, now, as you said, round 2 is just a few weeks away, and for the top schools, that's probably your last chance, at least, for the top US schools. And so, it doesn't give you a lot of time to really, build sort of alternatives transcript between now and the beginning of January. So, if you feel that your academic track record, your undergrad, maybe your GRE or your GMAT is not doing you a lot of favors, and you think you could, you could present better academic credentials if given, the additional time. It may well be worth holding off until next fall and giving yourself the time. And most people find that the GMAT takes longer than they expect to get the score that they would like. Average, probably people spend at least 3 months preparing for the GMAT, and it's very tough to juggle test prep with working on applications with very demanding day job as well, people can just have a bad day on testing day and don't get the score that they are capable of. I mean, one of the good things now is that you can take the GMAT, cancel the score, and that does not turn up on your test report. So, when I was working at INSEAD, we would see the your official score report, and you would see if the candidate had taken the test and they had cancelled. And so the fact that that doesn't appear on your report anymore gives you the liberty to take the test more times, because you're not worried about how is it going to look to the school if I've taken the test 4 or 5 times. Is it going to look like I'm really struggling with this? So that gives you more liberty to retake, and GMAC is reporting increased volumes of test taking as a result of this policy, I think. So if you're not far away from having a strong GMAT and you think you could retake, you could potentially schedule a date for sometime in December and give it a shot, see what happens. Maybe you'll get a good surprise, maybe you won't, and if you don't, then you can cancel the score. But if you feel that your academic track record is a genuine weakness in your application and it's not as good as it could be, then give yourself the benefit of the additional time. It's unlikely that the difference of waiting an extra year is going to really have a tremendous impact on your chance of admission, age-wise or experience-wise. It's always better to apply when you're really well prepared and you think you've done your best job that you can across all aspects of your profile, rather than rushing to submit now.
Right. Now, of course, you're fired up and enthusiastic and determined to meet those deadlines that start in early January, and your recommenders are enthusiastic and supportive, but they may well be spending time with family or running away to a beach or ski slope if they can. It's one of the busiest times for Fortuna as we approach those round 2 deadlines. But and any sort of words of you spoke earlier about actually trying to sit down, with recommenders rather than trying to do this over email or by the phone. Yeah. And any sort of guidelines that this is a new set of schools, there might be a particular characteristic that we therefore want to bring in about teamwork that we hadn't emphasized in round 2. Judith, what should we be trying to achieve with recommenders in these remaining weeks?
Well, I think recommenders really appreciate being kept in the loop. I know that it's helpful for them to hear, like, look, I applied A, B, and C. I was interviewing at 2. I didn't get into the 3rd. I still haven't heard yet, but I need to prepare, and I'm looking at these schools, and then you provide them with the ammunition and the data. It makes it so much easier, and if you did good prep on your first time around with these interviewers, they're going to be supportive the second time around. They know that there's not a lot of heavy lifting involved necessarily if you have prepared them well. So you want them to understand, if you're looking at Yale, it's a really small program, which is why your hands-on experience and your ability to collaborate and build community is going to be very important, and that's something that they're going to want to talk about. But here's the hitch. They're not going to know that unless you tell them. So your job in this next conversation you have with them is to really make sure that they know exactly why you're applying to certain schools and anything additional that they are going to need to put in for you. These are people that have taken the time, that are enthusiastic, they want to be supportive, and they also want to do it right. So I think sometimes applicants feel like, oh, I don't want to bother them, I don't want to handhold too much. The truth is, too much handholding is never a bad thing unless you become, checking in every single day. But the more of a information package you can give them, and the more open you are with them, the better this is going to be. Understanding again that they are coming up on the holidays, and they'll get it done. I mean, without a doubt, you want to check in with them. To make sure that things are moving along smoothly. But I do feel that round 2 is a great time, pre-round 2, again, to have another sit down and to kind of infuse that with, and this is what I'm looking at coming up. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and this is what I'd like to talk about with you. So again, preempting, preloading, preparing, so to speak, and then that'll really help you get into the next phase with your recommenders.
Oh, you're muted, Matt.
Mute Matt. Matt.
My favorite track. Yeah. There are some data points out there, whether it's GMAT and GRE or GPA, where we can look at sort of average scores coming into the class. But the essays themselves, these are the personal stories. This is, why business school at this stage? This is where I see myself 3-5 years from now? What matters to me, and global experience that you may have had along the way. This perhaps really is an area where, for somebody that struggled with rejections from round one, really wants to get some input and some honest feedback, ideas that miss the point or fail to capture, some key experience that they overlooked and yet would have been of great interest to the schools. Caroline, are you sometimes surprised, when you look at people's applications, with some of the things that they've missed, or just the way that they've constructed that story and how they might have done a better job?
Yes, I mean, choosing the right examples is really important, and as I was saying earlier, just thinking about the different things that the school is looking for and how you can weave that into your application overall. So, for the international schools like INSEAD London Business School, getting across that international perspective is very important. And, especially for candidates who don't have a lot of international experience on their CV, where it might not be so evident that, they've spent big chunks of their working career or their student life outside of the home country. So, but if they work for a multinational company, then perhaps they have a lot of experience of working in very international teams, and they may have, had some assignments abroad, where they've spent significant chunks of time outside of their home office. That's often the case with consultants, for example, where they may have spent time on assignments in other locations, and that might not always be so obvious from the resume. And so, making sure that those things come across clearly in the application will be very important. And then thinking carefully about, just the examples that you're showcasing in your application. With some schools, you get the opportunity to write about, your greatest achievement or something that you're particularly proud of. Or you may be asked to write about a failure and something that went wrong, and what happened and what you learned from that. And you really need to think very carefully about those examples, and especially what it says about what you can contribute to the classroom. So sometimes you might have something that you think, well, this is a great achievement and I'm really proud of it, but the business school, the admissions committee might not see, exactly how that is going to enable you to bring a different perspective. So sometimes, it's good to brainstorm different options that you have for the examples that you can put in your application, and perhaps get some external feedback on that as well, because something that might not be so obvious to you as a very impressive story might actually be a very interesting story for business school. And also, something that I see, I've often seen candidates get wrong in applications will be essays about failure or descriptions of what are your weaknesses, because often candidates are afraid of those questions and they'll try to underplay it. So they will, for example, sidestep questions about weaknesses by saying, I'm a perfectionist and I drive myself too hard. Or I expect too much of myself, or I expect too much of other people.
Sorry,
and things like that.
I hate those answers.
And it's so hackneyed and so common, and it doesn't come across as very authentic or very honest. And then with examples of failure, and that's one of the questions that you have to write about for INSEAD as well as some other schools. And sometimes candidates will choose quite an insignificant example because they're afraid of actually writing about something that was quite a dramatic failure. And in those situations, I tell clients, actually the best candidates have the most dramatic stories of failure. And if you look at anyone who is very successful in the long term, they've probably had some pretty major failures along the way. I mean, ask Richard Branson about Virgin Cola and things like that. People who have stuck their neck out and taken risks. Sometimes it will go very well and sometimes it won't. And if you've never failed at anything significant, then perhaps you haven't achieved anything significant either. So so it's a bit counterintuitive, but sometimes having a really meaty story about failure says a lot more about you than something that was really not a big deal and was several years ago, and doesn't really tell the school much about who you are today.
Right. Now, both of you work with clients on a ding analysis to assess what may have gone wrong, and we also have free consultations as we review resumes, look at some of those data points, and with the amount of experience in the team to give a very candid assessment of people's chances as they now approach round two. So obviously encourage our viewers to sign up for one of those consultations. In the last 10 minutes, as we look at some of the questions that we're getting from the audience, Vadim, in his case, has limited work experience. So his question, do you focus more heavily on any other specific parts of the application, things that you've achieved during your time at college? How can you work to compensate a lack of work experience, perhaps compared to the 3, 4, 5 years that many of the schools might be looking for?
Well, I think that there's lots of ways to show work experience and to show professional experience, even if it may be not in a typical setting. So if you've had opportunities to work with teams in university, or you've run organizations outside of your 1 or 2 years of work experience, if you volunteer and you have a committee. So you don't always have to think about work experience per se as you're going to an office or you're going to do a job, and it's 3 years and then you apply. If you feel like you're ready earlier than that, certainly there are some ways to show your leadership, your collaborative nature, your ability to engage, your communication skills. You've had a failure along the way, I'm sure, that you can talk about. But a big question for you, Vadim, would be, why do you want to apply now? So thinking about your profile, do you think that you would benefit from an additional year of more formalized work experience before you go back and spend the money and the time and take 2 years out of your life or a year to go and get your MBA? So that's important. You want to make sure that you're applying and attending at the optimal time to really push your personal and professional growth. And if it's just because you can't get the job that you want or you're not quite sure what to do right now, I would probably say there are other ways to affect that discussion, and going to business school may not be the right next thing for you. And I don't know that much more about you. I would say that a year out of college may be a little too early to be applying. And I'm not sure what Caroline thinks, but certainly from my perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I would just add that part of the issue is that it can be difficult for the admissions committee to evaluate your professional potential if you don't have a lot of experience, and so the schools will often take the perspective that past performance is the best predictor of future success, and so they need some demonstration of results and achievements. And as Judith said, it might not be in your day job, it might be through leadership and other capacities, but you need to be able to show your level of performance, whether it's in your day job or elsewhere. But they need to see evidence of results and drive and ambition and achievement orientation, and so that's sometimes difficult for schools to evaluate at a very early stage. So if you think that you've got sufficient material to be able to demonstrate that at an early stage, then certainly give it a try, but otherwise, maybe better to wait for a bit longer.
Now, I'm going to give you the final question. You don't have to answer it yet, but I want to give you a couple of minutes just to prepare it in your mind.
Oh, God.
With your experience, with tens of thousands of applications, if you had to sort of come up with a top 3 of the most common reasons that applicants are rejected. So I'll let you think about that one, and while you do, another question that came in: an individual who decided to take a gap year. So they have a number of years of professional experience, but they've taken a gap year away from work, and in this case used it to develop their quant skills. Now, do you need a full year to develop those quant skills? How would that come across to the schools? If you decide to take a break and windsurf in the Pacific or whatever, what works and what falls short in the eyes of the admissions committee?
Yeah, so if you're taking some time off, then the school wants to see that you're using the time well. So you should definitely talk about how you're going to spend that time and hopefully you're doing some other things beyond just, you know, preparing for the GMAT or, you know, building your quantitative profiles. So, you know, perhaps there's some volunteer projects you can get involved in, or you know, sometimes people will do a pre-MBA internship. I'm working with a client right now who's planning to quit her job in engineering, and she wants to shift into the fashion industry post-MBA, and she's lining up an internship in that industry before she goes off to business school. So it can be absolutely fine to have quit your job, but it's important to show that you're using that time well. And the school might be concerned if it sounds like, you know, you need a full year to prepare for the GMAT or to prepare your quant profile. They might be concerned that you know, you're going to be, the pace of the MBA and the intensity of the experience and the academic rigor might be tough for you if you need that much time to prepare for the academic side.
The same thing goes for, you never want to take 6 months off to do your applications. I mean, it doesn't look good. It doesn't incur a sense of, or engender a sense of, this person can do a work-life balance, or this person is able to, you know, get a lot of things done. It's okay to be thoughtful, and you can certainly take a month if you feel like you want to use your vacation that way. But taking, you know, 6 months off to work on your applications, when I was in admissions, it sort of always raised an eyebrow.
So without detailed explanation, just 1, 2, 3. Some of the common reasons that the most common reasons people are getting rejected.
Doesn't know the school. Does not have a sense of the fit, doesn't know the culture, doesn't understand what they're going to be doing there, sort of decided to apply because it sounded good, but doesn't really, or says something like, as Wharton is the premier finance school in the world, like, I'm rolling my eyes. But there's so many other things that you could possibly say about a school, and that should not be your header. So really, that to me was number one, even ahead of, believe it or not, GMAT and GPA. It was knowing what you were about to get yourself into was to me and to the team at Wharton really, really critical.
Great. Right. Well, I guess as we approach the end of this hour, of course, both of you are part of a Fortuna team with, you know, hundreds of years of experience in the admissions office. You know, you've been in those and had these discussions with your colleagues, no doubt, about she doesn't know the school, or well, that GMAT school is never going to cut it. So for all of the listeners, as they look towards round 2, do reach out to us for that free consultation, whether you're bouncing back from the results of round 1 or just really want to optimize your time between now and those January deadlines. Easy just to get online, leave your basic contact details, and you know, we want that call to be as useful to you for your own business school plans. You'll also find on the website just a wealth of material that Judith and Caroline, Emma, Malvina, you know, so many of our colleagues across the top schools from the US and Europe have put together on these sort of subjects: how to stand out in the applicant pool, women applying to business school, the over 30s. There's just an enormous amount of experience in the different blog posts, so do check those out. And thank you for being with us. Of course, thank you to Judith and to Caroline for the last hour, and we look forward to being in touch with everybody that joined us for today's webinar. So thank you very much, and we'll see you on Fortuna's website very soon.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.